WCEG Talk Radio.com. Click live stream tab or watch us on your smart TV, YouTube, WCEG Network. I'm Dr. Wanzo, your host of Mind Matters for the next hour. We are the worldwide community empowerment group where we speak life into the community. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and on Instagram at WCEG_talk_radio and at WCGE Network. Last but not least, the topics and opinions are those of the show host and guests and not WCEG Network. Thank you for your continued support. Good evening and welcome to Mind Matters, where we discuss relevant mental health issues. I'm your host, Dr. Cassandra Wanzo. I'm a psychiatrist. I have been practicing in Atlanta for 30 years. As of this year, it's hard to believe, 30 years. I'm only 25. No. Our co-host is Norman Carter Jr. He's a retired Philadelphia police corporal. He's written a book that's very relevant to these times, The Long Blue Walk, My Journey as a Philly Cop. It's available on Amazon and is very timely. He also hosts his own show on WCEG Network called Issues and Answers on Mondays at 4 p.m. Hi, Norm.
Hello there. How are you, Doctor?
I see we have our very, very special guest who has joined us. State Representative B. Nguyen. Did I pronounce that correct?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Representative Nguyen has been serving the 89th District of the Georgia House of Representatives since December 15th, 2017. This was the district formerly represented by Stacey Abrams. Representative Nguyen is the first Vietnamese American elected to the Georgia House of Representatives and the first Asian American Democratic woman to hold a state office in Georgia. She's a graduate of Georgia State University. She was previously the executive director of a nonprofit organization that she founded, Athena Warehouse, a program to educate and empower girls in under-resourced communities. Is it okay if I call you by your first name?
Oh, of course.
Welcome, B. So
I'm trying to turn off my my Apple computer settings in case the phone rings and we'll have a malfunction. But yes, call me B.
So our topic is racial violence, racism, and mental health. This is actually part 2 of the discussion, and this discussion was precipitated by the spa shootings in Atlanta on March 16th, where the shooter denied a racial motivation and said that he was motivated by sexual addiction. So I wanted to get your perspective on this, Representative Nguyen. What are your thoughts about the shooting and his, what he denies a racial motivation and saying it's based on sexual addiction? I'm just interested in getting your perspective on what happened.
Sure. And thank you for having me on, and thank you for having this relevant conversation. When I first learned of what happened that night, it was through text messages from a lot of my friends. And we have been having conversations, I think, broadly over the last year, just because there's been an increase in hate crimes against API folks because of the framing of the pandemic. And, it's really challenging because for most people who live in America, if you are attributing a virus to China, the folks who want to assign blame are going to assume anyone who looks like me is going to be Chinese, whether or not I am, whether or not I was born here. So it's just led to blanket attacks on all Asian people living in this country. And my first thought was, when I learned that it was 3 different spas that are Asian owned, I thought it has to be a hate crime. But I was also, hoping maybe there could be not that there would be any kind of a better explanation. But, you know, when a horrific crime happens, I think all of us want to know some sort of answer. And, you know, I suspected it was a very racially targeted killing. And in the aftermath, learning about everything, the details of what happened, I still maintain the same position. It was a hate crime based on both race and based on gender. And the Cherokee County law enforcement officer trying to humanize the suspect in custody. It's not new in America, and it's not new to dehumanize victims, especially when it comes to people of color, and especially when it comes to Black Americans. We hear it all the time. And so my mind immediately went to when Dylan Roof was taken to Burger King after the Charleston, South Carolina shooting. But even in the recent days, as we're learning about some of the police brutality cases, and even watching the trial of Derek Chauvin, people are still trying to assign blame to George Floyd.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, it was incredibly painful because it hit so close to home. I live a few miles away from the two spas in Atlanta.
Oh, you do?
And yeah. And it was, and, I have always been an ally for the racial justice movement. I have always wanted to see restorative justice, have always stood with Black lives. And when that happened to the Asian community, the pain felt different. And I thought, and all of my Black friends said, we feel you, sister. We got your back. We know exactly how this feels. We know your pain too well. And I thought, is there ever going to be a time in our lives where we can deeply sympathize with each other and empathize with each other in such a personal way that doesn't require it happening to people in our own communities? And I think that's why white people do not get it, because it doesn't happen to them. And so my question was, are they ever going to get it? Does it require, what will it require for them to feel that type of pain, to feel that type of empathy, and to build real solidarity with people? And so, there are so few Asian people in Georgia and in elected offices that immediately there was rapid response. We had an 8 a.m. call the next day with some of the organizers and just try to figure out, what do the families need? What do we need to do? What's the messaging around this? And from that moment, for the next couple of weeks, it was just one thing after the other. And I had no time to process my pain or grief or anger, but I was enraged. I was enraged by the framing by law enforcement. And I was more enraged as I learned additional details. So some of the details were, in Cherokee County, they detained the Latino husband of one of the victims, and he was sitting in the back of a cop car for hours.
Yes.
And then in Atlanta, one of the husbands showed up at the spa, and they did not follow procedures for making sure there was a translator on scene. So he's doing CPR on his wife, who is presumably dead, and he's, pleading for help in Korean, and the APD officer can't offer him any kind of assistance. And I thought, God, my parents, they speak English as a second language. They still have really heavy accents. And I speak Vietnamese, but when I'm in distress, my language of choice is English. And when I fight with my parents in Vietnamese, I get all more emotional, more frustrated. I can't get my words out. And I thought, God, I cannot even imagine the trauma of trying to communicate to somebody who is supposed to be there to help you as your wife is dying. And then there were just more horrific things that emerged. It took so long to identify some of the women because they lived in such isolation. It said that, some of the women who work in the Atlanta spa live and work there.
Live in the spa?
Yes. And it was hard because there were 8 people, 6 of them Asian women, and all had different roles in the business. Like the business owners had different lives, that they were married, had families. some of the women that worked in the spa were working class women. And one of the women, the only family members that she has in the United States are her two sons, who didn't even learn about their mom dying until one of the other victims' daughters called her son. And the police had already released the names of the victims. And there's one woman who's still unclaimed. Nobody has come forward for her. And the community hosted a funeral service for her. So it's a lot. It was a lot to unpack. It was really hard to figure out how to talk about it in a way where we were not giving any credence to this sex addiction, but also recognizing the complexity of the exploitation of Asian women, both here and overseas. And also the family members said, my mom was not a sex worker. She did not engage in any explicit activities. And so it just, imploded in the way that it was being reported, was a disservice in a lot of ways. And the subsequent conversations that newsrooms have had over their reporting have been, I'm told, very emotional, because in newsrooms, because of the lack of diversity, all the Asian reporters had to step up. And a lot of them are women. And then the non-Asian reporters who are reporting on this chose to frame it in a way that was really disrespectful for the families and sort of sensationalized and not very nuanced or thoughtful about what they were doing. And so it was incredibly painful, all of it was. And I felt it was really
still painful. Yeah, I can see it's still painful.
Yeah. I felt really responsible for doing as much media as I could during that time, because I did not want the narrative to be told by people who just could not culturally understand or would offer any kind of justification for the suspect in custody, which we did see. And so I was just head down, like, I need to get through this. I need to make sure that I'm talking about this in a way that is respectful to the families, but is also telling the truth about our history in this country. And also making sure that when we talk about the rise in AAPI crimes, that I will...
For some of our audience members who may not understand the term, because I only recently understood.
Oh, yeah, of course. So it's Asian American Pacific Islander.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so the statistic, we saw 150% increase over the last year in hate crimes, and 68% are women.
Yes.
And some of the media and also people, just, I guess, other people, are also trying to do this thing where they want to create a wedge between the Asian community and the Black community. Exactly. And bringing up these incidences where, in some cases in the West Coast, the perpetrator was a Black man. And I have been very, very forthcoming about telling my API community that my legislative Black caucus members, the Georgia NAACP, my Black friends reached out to me immediately and had my back, and they stood with us and they have shown up for us, and we better show up for them for Black Lives Matter, and also not allow this continuation of this narrative that we're the model minority or we're superior.
You brought that up. Can you talk more about the model model minority? That was one of the questions I was going to ask you about, the model minority stereotype. So
yeah. It's so fascinating because I've done a lot of just diving into Asian history in the country, and it's so complex because my parents are Vietnamese refugees. So my family did not come here until 1979. We don't have a long history in the United States. Okay. And because everyone's from a different country, the migration patterns are different. And when you look at everybody's migration pattern and ethnicities, it looks really different. Like Vietnamese people are actually poorer. Like Vietnamese women make 64 cents on the white man's dollar because they were fleeing war. So there wasn't any kind of skilled worker visa that brought in a bunch of people. And then after the Chinese rail workers came in at the inception of our country, we passed the Exclusion Act, which blocked any kind of migration for all Asian people for decades. Yes. And so it kind of breaks up the history. Like there aren't generations of family who can carry on the stories and pass on, like, this is what happened in, you know, Chinatown in San Francisco, where they mass lynched a bunch of Chinese rail workers. And then, but, you know, I've been like really diving into a lot of those things. And I know that in the 60s, that the Asian community and the Black community organized together, and we did not have the right to vote. And we, you know, the Black community led that movement and we benefited from it. We were not allowed to date interracially. We were not allowed to own property for a long time. And so I really think that the erasure of Asian history is part of the problem, because we're not telling these stories. There's not enough people to tell those stories. There's not enough generations that lasted through. And then the disruption of migration and how different people came at different times. And so the model
brought that up, that the Asian community is not monolithic. I'm glad that you bring it's not monolithic. Yeah. Like any community, yes.
Like, we don't even speak the same language. So that also makes it harder to organize, right? But to your point, that the model minority myth did come after white America saw people organizing together to gain civil rights and needed to disrupt that, because
exactly,
we know we're more powerful when we come together.
Exactly.
And the Asian community embraced that. And it was, you know, the desire to be accepted by white America, proximity to whiteness, the idea that proximity to whiteness equals power. And also probably like, we were like, fine, we'll take the target off our back, right? And so it's been generational too. I think for a lot of younger Asian folks, you're seeing a shift in how we view things historically and present day. And you're seeing younger people recognize that we are not going to continue to adopt this model minority myth, and that we need to stand in solidarity with Black Americans, and we need to address the anti-Blackness in our communities. And we need to have really tough conversations about what that looks like and how we can heal and how we can have accountability for our own behavior.
Yeah, I agree with you. We need to stand in solidarity, because the fight is against white supremacy and structural racism, and all hate and violence should be denounced. That's my position. So we all need to be in solidarity. I know that there were some people on Facebook, and I read a couple of weeks ago, who said, these are quotes from some people on Facebook, "It's not our struggle." Someone else said, "It's been happening to Black folks in this country over 400 years. There has been no outcry from the Asian community about all the violent acts against Black people. They make millions in our communities every year." These are just comments people made on Facebook. So yeah, yes.
And they're valid, right? I mean, one thing that, and I think because I live in Atlanta and my neighborhood is actually majority Black and white. I don't actually live in an AAPI area. And so my experience has been different. And I went to a lynching ceremony, and it was a reconciliation ceremony that the NAACP hosted, I think 2 years ago. And I was sitting inside the courthouse in Decatur, and there was a moment in which the facilitator said, "Okay, every white person in this room stand up and read this passage," which was an apology for slavery. And I was like, I don't know what to do. I'm like, I'm not white, and my family never had slaves, and I'm not Black. So if I stay seated, I'm not, you know, trying to accept the apology. But then I was like, well, if I stand up, then are people going to think that I think I'm a white person and I'm denying that I'm a person of color? And it, you know, I just had this moment like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And ultimately, I didn't stand up, because what we were being asked to read was not my truth. But I knew that it would raise questions for people. So the following Saturday, I went to the NAACP DeKalb chapter meeting because I wanted to acknowledge it. And I said, I want to address something that happened last week. And I explained to everyone in the room, like, what was going through my head. And somebody said, I'm so glad you explained that because I was confused. And then somebody was like, well, why should she stand? She's not a white person. And then there was a woman there and she said, you know, I am so tired of going to a barber shop or a nail shop or beauty supply store or a convenience store and having your people treat me like shit. You come into our communities, you put your businesses here, and then you disrespect us and take our money. And her pain was very real. And I was deeply saddened by it because I knew that what she was telling me was true. And, you know, I apologized to her and I said, I know my community needs to do better. And I understand the anger and I think that it is justified. And afterwards she got up and we hugged, but you know, it was really, I was ashamed and I was deeply saddened by it. But I understand why some people, the comments that you read, I understand that sentiment.
You do.
So yeah, I do.
Heard that before.
Yeah.
Kind of sentiments. Have you ever heard that before? People
say that again. Oh yeah. Not in my personal life. Usually on Twitter or Facebook.
Okay, yeah, this is from Facebook.
Yeah, yeah, because in our organizing community in Atlanta, it's usually Asian, Black, and Latinx organizing together. Okay. And that's who I spend my time with, right? And so my lived experience is different than, it's just different. And so I see that solidarity building because we're in a social justice space. But I do know it to be true, the anti-Blackness in the Asian community. And I do not want to, I would never try to invalidate anyone's pain over that. And I would not want to deflect any kind of accountability for it. And I have been very conscientious when talking to the Asian community, especially in the wake of this horrific crime. I'm like, we need to show up for the Black community. We need to do it. And we need to address our own anti-Blackness. And we need to reject white supremacy, reject the model minority, and heal and talk and grow from it. And it's going to take time. But I understand the comments that you read to me. They are painful to hear because the truth hurts. And it does sadden me, but you know, I would not try to invalidate people's feelings around it.
Wow, this is powerful. All the things I was going to ask you, you've come up with everything. You really ask questions. You've come up with everything, all the issues that I wanted to discuss. Getting back to the spa shootings, have they been determined? Have they been charged as hate crimes?
No, I was actually just thinking about that yesterday, like what the status was. Because our attention span is so short and the news cycle is so short. I don't think Cherokee County is going to do it. So, and I think that's a flaw in the way that this works, because the individual police departments have to make that determination. And so when you have
there's no state law for hate crimes.
There is a state law for hate crimes, but the jurisdiction in which they're prosecuting the crime, they have to make the decision to treat it as a hate crime.
Really?
And so Cherokee County, I do not think they're going to.
So there's no state law that supersedes that? I would think it would be a state law that would supersede that.
Only if the cases went through the state attorney general and didn't stay within the local jurisdictions. So Cherokee County, I don't think they will. Atlanta Police Department said they weren't ruling anything out. There's another chance that the FBI is involved.
Okay.
So there's a chance that it would be prosecuted as a federal hate crime. And when we met, so I got my letter from Joe Biden today. I know. I was, so the ask when we did meet with President Biden and Vice President Harris was to investigate as a hate crime. And what they told us was, on the face of this, it
Mhm.
does appear to be a hate crime, but it has to be corroborated by other evidence. And I don't know what the standard of evidence for that would be, because what's complicated is the examples that I've been given is he has to have like some demonstrated history of using like racial slurs or something, either on his social media or his phone.
Oh.
But in this particular case, it was much more nuanced. And a lot of times, hate crimes don't necessarily require you verbalizing a racial slur.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And then it complicates it because it's a gender-based crime too. He assigned blame to women because he thought they were responsible for whatever addiction issues that he had. Whether or not it was, in his mind, it was true. And so he wanted to eliminate the problem. And women, gender and sex are protected under hate crimes laws. So I don't know what's going to happen. I don't have high hopes, honestly, based on just some of the conversations that we've had. But what the Asian community, we feel it's a hate crime, and it's a pretty general consensus across the board.
I mean, I would call it a hate crime, and immediately when I saw who the person was, I said, "Oh yeah, it's a hate crime."
yeah. And also, it's the idea that the suspect in custody's what he says is what we should base it on is absurd. I'm like, and I said, at one point I said, look, when those 3 white men chased down Ahmaud Arbery and gunned him down, they said it was not a hate crime. They said it was self-defense and a citizen's arrest because they were in fear of their lives. And I'm like, so why are we taking his word as the truth? And I saw that repeated over and over again. And I got emails from angry white people because I said, this is a hate crime based on these things. And my position is unmoved. And I got angry emails from people. And, there were a couple people who called the victims prostitutes and filth and all these other things. And I thought, what kind of person are you when 8 people have been killed in a really, really brutal way? Like there were 3 women in the Atlanta spa who were shot at close range in the head. And one of their coworkers who did not die.
It was shot in the head. Oh no, I didn't know.
Yeah, in the head. Yeah. One of the coworkers in the other room said who wasn't a victim, she was hiding. She said it happened so fast with no hesitation that none of the women screamed. There's no sound. So she said the women didn't even have a last word and nothing. That's how fast it happened and how decisive he was. And so, I thought, what kind of person do you have to be to like really see, to think, okay, 8 people are dead, gruesome and brutal. And here you are emailing me who you actually don't know at all because you're mad about something I said on CNN or something. And your response is to degrade the women who are mothers and grandmothers and workers and humans. And I guess I can cognitively understand it, but I can't emotionally. It's just beyond my level of comprehension. Like, why would you ever do that? And to a community who's in pain, what purpose does it serve?
I think I read somewhere that you had to beef up your security because of some threats that you had.
That was actually last year when Trump's legal team came in and they were presenting their case on voter fraud, and I questioned one of the expert witnesses using all facts and showed that he was providing inaccurate evidence. And a lot of Trumpers were really angry about it. So what's interesting is somebody had asked me one time, like, oh, have you gotten any anti-AAPI hate against you since the pandemic? And I was like, I don't really know, because as an elected official, whenever I have a stance that people don't agree with, the first thing they do is attack the country from which my parents come from. And the second thing they do is attack my gender. And so I'm like, I think that's probably just standard. I was like, I don't think that's a pandemic driven thing. I think that just happens to women who have opinions, or people of color who have opinions, who dare like defy the reality of people who think that they should be in charge or something. And so I can't really tell, but that hearing, I did get death threats because they were streaming it on Newsmax. I don't know, whatever sites they use, they were streaming it everywhere. And they were really, really mad. And I did not read any of the comments because I don't want to do that to myself. But yeah, Fair Fight, Stacey Abrams.org was monitoring everything for all of us because, you know, ahead of time they said, look, you're going to have to make a decision about what you want to do in this committee meeting, because if you speak up, so it was me and my other colleague who's a Black woman, they said, if you two speak up and push back, you will get a target on your back more than anyone else on this committee. So you just have to decide what you want to do on it. And I was like, well, I sure as heck am not going to stay silent. I'm like, that's not what I was elected to do. And, you know, the stakes were so high. I'm like, these people are trying to overthrow our democracy and like erode our democracy. There's no way I'm going to be silent on this. And I knew I was going to get death threats, and my address was doxxed on like some.
Oh, so you knew you anticipated that you were going to get the.
Yeah. I knew what I was in for. My address was doxxed on like a right-wing gun site, and people were calling for my execution because they call me a traitor and all these other things. And so there were a few weeks where, you know, APD and law enforcement had to do drive-bys at my house. But, you know, something that was really like I think about all the time was the other lawmaker. She also got death threats, and she was like, there's no way I'm going to let law enforcement do drive-bys by my house. She's like, that's not going to make me feel any safer. And again, it's like those two different realities of law enforcement not being safe for everybody. And that, you know, that was really hard to hear. And, you know, I always, because I'm not, you know, I guess, so from a systemic standpoint, definitely, I mean, I don't like law enforcement, right? From personal and systemic. I'm trying to like, how do I say?
Norm is a law enforcement. He's retired corporal. Please, corporal.
As a generalization, as a system, right? And there's a distrust that I have. But when it came to my own personal safety, I was like, okay, please do the drive-bys. And she was like, heck no, don't do the drive-bys. And so it was just an illustration of just, you know, it's just different.
So Norm, you want to jump in here? You have any comments? Norm?
I have so many comments.
I know. I'm like, talk to us. Norman, we want to talk to you.
Yeah, you stirred up a lot of emotion. Yes, disclaimer, I am a retired Philadelphia police officer, 25 years experience, blah, 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 blah. But let's get on to some of the things now. And some of the things that impressed me was this victim shaming. Having been my experience in law enforcement, I've never seen anything like that, where the police department is coming out and basically sowing the seeds for a mental health defense for some lawyer who may be coming along and looking for an easy way out. But I have to add that one of my resolutions for this is that police departments all over need to recruit more AAPI citizens for police officer. They did that in Philadelphia, my home city, and focused the assignments of those police officers on communities that are predominantly AAPI or where in the AAPI business areas, because as you said, there is a communication issue, and also there's a trust issue. And I'm not saying that this needs to be universally like don't have any white cops in black areas, or that there shouldn't be a mixture of diversity communities. But people are more likely to talk to people who they think understand their cause. But I just wanted to say a couple of things. Donald Trump's presidency empowered a nasty underbelly in the United States that has always been with us, but has been repressed by laws and social pressure. And thanks to this president, these racists feel unashamedly empowered, and far too many mask themselves as Republicans. In addition, and you touched on this, although the genesis of this issue is with white supremacy, African Americans cannot be left off the hook. I'm not buying it. As in so many instances, such as referring to each other by epithets originated by slave masters, many of us mimic the behaviors of our oppressors. The lady who talked to you about Asian stores and nail salons and whatnot, that's a deep-seated prejudice on her part that was coming out when you really look at it. And I clearly remember in my home city of Philadelphia, a celebrity by the name of Georgie Wood stating on his programs that African Americans should be outraged at the number of stores in their neighborhoods owned by Asian Americans. This was a very popular disc jockey in Philadelphia. This began a prolonged series of attacks on stores owned by Asian Americans that included several murders.
Really?
And there's no doubt in my mind that this racist idiocy continues among other misguided Americans. And excuse me, but we talked about history and people not paying attention to history. Please let me run this down for you. People versus Hall, 1854. That was in California. It started because they thought Asians were stealing white jobs. The Chinese Massacre of 1871. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The Rock Springs Massacre in 1885 in Wyoming. The San Francisco plague outbreak. I'm going to go on. The Japanese internment, World War II. We all know about that. The Vietnamese shrimpers and the KKK. That was in Texas. That was a big story. The LA riots, where African Americans attacked Korean-owned stores in Los Angeles. 9/11, that also inspired hatred. The Atlanta spa shootings, and there are probably more. But I think when we talked about history, let's not begin by trying to absolve people of responsibility or trying to whitewash what history is, because that's how racism and these racist attacks continue. They're not new. And I think it's abhorrent that we don't have more Republicans speaking out as you are, State Representative Nguyen. I don't understand it. It's inhumane, it's un-American, and that type of behavior, as I said earlier, the genesis of it all was Donald Trump, because he allowed these people to feel empowered. And there are now hundreds of them in Congress who support the type of racism that we see that led to the murders of these AAPI people in our area.
I see we have Mr. Daji Kuweza, who has joined us. He has studied, lived, and worked in China. Did you have anything you'd like to?
Sorry for my apologies for some other things that have been coming up here. It's been an interesting day.
Yeah, so
I know I missed a lot, so I caught the end of that conversation. Perhaps I just let someone else talk for a minute so I can feel out what else has been said that I might want to tag into. But I agree. I think we talked before about that. I agree that what I get the gist of what you said is that, yes, we're not innocent, of those things that other people are doing also. There's been Black people and et cetera, right? It's flourishes. It flourishes among us in a number of different ways. One of my friends knew from way back in when I was a freshman, right? He was telling me one time and afterwards that you can hear me okay, am I right?
Yes. Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. So he was saying that, and we were in New York. I grew up in New York, and it was in the 80s, I guess, it became what they call the Green Grocer Wars, of which the Koreans were basically kind of getting into everything, everywhere, right?
Mhm.
And he was expounding the idea that somehow or another, they were able to do all this because the government was giving them special money.
Mhm.
It wasn't that they were working hard, those other kind of things. There was some other kind of devious thing going on to give them support. And I don't think I've ever convinced them that that was wrong.
Because I did. I've heard people say that. Is there any truth to that at all? I've heard people say that. Is there any truth to that at all?
I don't think
I'm
so.
having trouble with my sound for some reason.
Yeah.
I can't hear you that for some reason very well. Let me
Yeah,
see.
I've heard people say that.
I can say that
My sound is a little off.
in my home city.
Can you repeat that for me, or are you talking to me? Or?
No,
Okay.
I was saying, like you were saying, how people were saying that some of the people in the Asian American communities who set up, business in the Black community were given special benefits or loans. I was asking, is there any truth to that at all?
As far as I know, no.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I don't, as far as I know, no, I would say no.
Are you aware? I mean,
No, I'm not. I would say, like, one of the conversations that does come up is that when refugees are resettled, refugees do get financial support. And I do think that that creates some tension as well.
Okay.
But, the refugee resettlement is also a lot of times we're resettling people because we intervened in their country in some way.
Exactly.
So
Yes. Yes.
We're trying to atone for our involvement. So, and Norman, I'm so glad you brought up the KKK fishing community or shrimping community, because I don't think a lot of people know about it. And
I had heard about that. What happened?
So Vietnamese people, when we resettled so there are a lot of fishing, there's a huge fishing industry in Vietnam. And there were a lot of Vietnamese people who resettled in Texas and New Orleans because of coastal, and they started shrimping, and it created tension and competition between white people and Vietnamese shrimpers. And so the KKK started making threats to blowing people's boats up. And Norman, you probably know more about it than I do, but they started threatening basically to blow people's boats up. And eventually the Southern Poverty Law Center got involved and filed a lawsuit. But yeah.
Wow.
And I think another thing, and where misconception comes in, is that people don't realize, and I'm going to go back to Vietnam and Cambodia, the people, certain people in those countries risked their lives to help out the American soldiers and the American movement in those countries. And those people had to be extricated from Vietnam and brought to the United States for their own safety. And a lot of them were settled in certain areas. And yes, they were given some assistance. Was it whole still like millions and millions of dollars? No, that wasn't true. But the other part of that is that people don't realize, I know that this happened in certain communities that I'm certainly aware of, is that people pooled their resources and made group purchases of items for stores. So if I have a store and someone has a store over here, we pool our resources so that we can get the best prices for what we have. And then we divide everything up. And then we're able to allow to make a profit and for our businesses to flourish. This is what happens. People form these conglomerates, however small or large they can be. And that's what happens. And that's how people become have viable businesses that survive in certain communities. And the other part about it, let's stop this nonsense about people coming into their communities and setting up businesses, and you're so outraged about it. Set up your own business. And I hate to sound callous about that, but businesses don't succeed or thrive where there is no need. So consequently, in these communities where you see these nail shops and these other salons that are popping up, there's a need for them. There's a need for it. And let's go back to the shootings here. This gentleman had opportunities to go to other massage parlors that were occupied by African Americans or Caucasian people. He chose not to do that. He chose specifically to go to places of where there were AAPI employees. The other part of that is, I don't want to hear about his sexual addiction. Do you know how many sexually addicted people there are in America who do not kill people?
A lot. Right. They don't kill people.
So the police department needs to stop giving people excuses.
Yeah.
That's again, we're going back to victim shaming. That's
what
like
Norman, he had a bad day.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
He had a bad day.
Yeah.
He had a bad day. But you know, to Norman, so Norman, something, you know, related to, so my parents were refugees. They left by boat. And my dad was in the lieutenant army. I mean, he was a lieutenant in the medical army. And back then, so Saigon fell in 75. And basically anyone who had close relations to America based on probably rank and what their role was, they were flown out of the embassy. And my mom's sister and her husband and all of their children were flown out. My mom was single at the time, and they tried to bring her. They brought her to the embassy, and they said, no, immediate family only. And people were scaling, desperate to get out. And you know, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of Americans who formed close relationships with their cooks, their tailors, their cleaners, and they try to bring all of them too, because they knew that if they were left behind, they would maybe be killed or locked up in re-education camp. So, you know, my family tells this story, and all the cousins are young. They're close to my mom, who was, you know, in her 20s, and they had to leave her. And they were like, we don't know if she's going to die or not. And one of the young cousins, her niece, was like, I'm not going. I am not getting on this plane unless my aunt comes with me. And of course, that's absurd. I mean, she's a little girl. They're like, no, you are getting on. And so my mom ended up staying behind, and my dad ended up in a remote jungle in prison for 3 years. And they did this thing where they said, okay, this is what's going to happen. Anyone who has an education, a teacher, a doctor, you are going to turn yourselves in, and you're just going to serve 2 weeks. And what you're going to do is you're going to learn about the new form of government. And so my dad turned himself in, and they took him to a remote jungle and kept him in there for 3 years. But he was lucky, because my uncle was in for 5. I had another uncle who served in the army. He was in for 7. And there are a lot of people who didn't make it out alive. And, you know, my parents don't really talk about it very much. My dad never talks about that time period in his life. Very, very rarely he might share 1 or 2 stories. So we don't actually know what happened to him. And then, so I try to, you know, I have a complicated relationship with my dad. He obviously suffers from post-traumatic stress syndrome, as do a lot of refugees, and there are no mental health services. And probably an unwilling.
No mental health services?
No, because when you're resettled in, like, they were resettled in Iowa, there's not going to be any Vietnamese speaking mental health service providers. And then we grew up in Augusta. And there's also this mentality, I think that's pretty common in developing nations or with communities of color, where they're like, no, we're fine. And depression is not real, or post-traumatic stress syndrome is not real. There's just not a real recognition or acceptance that mental health is extremely important and that it is necessary to seek that type of help. And so I try to think about, because, you know, you always recall like the lessons that your parents teach you, right, as a little kid. And one of my dad's lessons that he has always said to me and my sisters all the time is, never trust anyone. Never trust anyone. Never trust anyone. And that's not like a life lesson that any parent really wants to envision passing down to their children. And I try to, you know, think about it from his like frame of mind. And I'm like, he probably feels really, really foolish for turning himself in and believing that it was going to be 2 weeks, and then it turned into 3 years. And so there's all this really layered stuff that happened over there. And they escaped by boat in the middle of the night. They got stranded in the middle of the ocean. And at the time when people were fleeing, there were Thai pirates who would raid all these boats and steal all the belongings, sometimes kidnap the women and children, almost all the time raped the women and children on board. And that happened to my family's boat twice. And they took everything, and they poured oil on all their food. So they were just left stranded with nothing. And my cousin told me, she was a little girl, that my mom picked her up and hid her in a barrel to try to protect her. And every woman on the ship was raped, with the exception of the little girl in the barrel, and then one of my cousins who was 10 months pregnant.
Ripped by who were the
Thai pirates? The Thai pirates.
Wow.
And so they all thought they were going to die. They were like, we're done, we're gone. And a Thai fisherman found them. And there were a lot of maritime laws at the time, because there was such an influx of refugees that countries stopped accepting people, and there were conditions under which they could accept people. And at the time, Thailand was like, no, we're not taking any more Vietnamese people. There's nowhere to put them. But there was an exception to the rule. And that rule was, you can help somebody if they no longer have like a vessel. Like if they're like, their boat broke or whatever. So he helped them destroy the boat, and then took them all in on his fishing vessel, and then brought them to refugee camp. And, there was a language barrier. They couldn't communicate with each other. But he saved their lives. Like, just some fishermen saved their lives, and we don't know his name. We don't know anything about him. And they ended up getting resettled in Iowa because there was a Republican governor. Jimmy Carter was our president, and there was a Republican governor. And at that time, the Republican governor was like, I will help as many Vietnamese refugees as I can. And Jimmy Carter had just doubled the number of Vietnamese refugees from 5,000 to 10,000 a month, and probably cost him his presidency. And it was like very controversial and very opposed by the majority of Americans. And when you're resettled, it's a faith-based organization, and then like a family would agree that they would help with the cost of finding a place. And there are limitations to it. It's like 3 months or something. We'll pay the rent for 3 months, help you find a place, help you learn how to drive, like get all your paperwork and all these things like that. And then the benefits that you get as a refugee is you are provided food stamps. And I do think that you do get Medicaid for a few months. But you have to pay back your plane ticket. So the cost of you flying from whatever country you came from into the United States, you have to pay that back.
Really?
Yeah. So, it's complicated. There are some things that the government does provide, but it's not to the point where people are, gonna flourish or thrive in any way. And the Vietnamese community, I think this is probably true of a lot of different countries, live in really close proximity to each other and generationally. And that's probably also how they can build some capital, because like in Vietnam, you live with your parents until you are married. And that's the norm. It's like, and you take care of your elders, and it's multiple generations, and you just live in like close quarters. And so I had a bunch of family members, like my parents and like a bunch of cousins. There were like 30 of them that were resettled in Iowa. They all wanted to live together. They didn't want to move apart from each other. And it was the American family that was like, no, you need to get your own place. You need to get your own place. We're like, but we don't want to live together. And that was like, a cultural aspect that I think was pretty hard for my family, because they were used to like being in such close proximity. They don't, like when children turn 18, they don't go away to college. And that was very painful for them to accept. They're like, what? You want to move and go to college and be away from us? And so it's just really different. And the way that money flows is, the expectation is different. There are no boundaries. It's like, you have to give your money to your family, and you have to take care of your siblings. And it's like really shared money, right? It's not, you get your own bank account and you get your own bank account. It's just like the cultural norms are different. And so when you have these Vietnamese businesses, you often see like, the 10-year-old kid bringing a bowl of pho to the table, and he's all mad that he has to go work in his family business and is probably not supposed to anyway because he's 10. And so you see a lot of family members like having to work in these businesses.
Okay.
And part of why they chose to open small businesses is because none of the degrees transfer unless you're a doctor. So my dad was a pharmacist and my mom was a social worker. So my dad had to go back to school altogether, and my mom just never went back to school. She had 5 kids. And so you can open a business though. You can open a business without a college degree. And so then you see lots of restaurants, nail shops, dry cleaners, things like that. So it's partly because of that too. It was like the only thing they could do. There were no other options. There was no, it just turned out to be that way. But one thing that I know I went on a tangent, but one thing I do think I want to share is, I think is relevant to the racial conversation is the number of Black men who had a fight in Vietnam and then come back home and get treated like shit. And during this whole civil justice movement, and they were fighting a war that, was a proxy war, and and then they go home and get treated like shit. And when I was knocking on doors in my district, it was really interesting because I have a lot of Black veterans in my district. And when I would knock on the door, you'd see my name and they'd be like, "Oh, I know your name. You're Vietnamese."
Oh.
Some of the veterans, they really wanted to talk to me. So I went in, we sat on the couch, we talked for a long time. And, it was like their only connection to this country that they had been to many years ago. And, I have a special place in my heart for veterans that served in Vietnam. And I would always thank them. And then we would just chat about things. And then there were some other veterans who were really angry at me. And, I feel their pain. And so it was, I thank you for your service. I'm so sorry. So, it's complicated.
Wow. Wow. Yes. I had no idea all the things that you've described. Everything that you've shared, it's been very powerful, very informative. I really want to thank you. If there's anything I can do, because I'm a psychiatrist, really, from a mental health perspective, contribute to your campaign, because I like the way you think, and definitely so. I don't think I'm in your district, so.
Where are you?
I live in Wyuka, so I don't think that's your district, Wyuka.
No. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if anything I can help as far as I'm serious to contribute to your campaign or mental health or anything I can do, so I'm serious about that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
For the help, yes.
Yeah, and same, like if there's any legislation you think is important or any issues that we need to address at the General Assembly. And also, I think there's more conversation right now going on between the Asian and Black community by some of the community organizations. Okay. And yeah, if you ever want to be a part of that or or something.
Yes. So you have my email from, I think your assistant has my email.
Maria's got it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Again, I want to thank you so much for joining. This has been very powerful and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Norm, too. And Daji, he had to leave. He was having technical difficulties, but this has been very empowering. This is the worldwide WCEG, part of the Worldwide Empowerment Group. Have a good evening and thank you for tuning in. Thanks.
Thank you.